just yet, but I'll just keep on meeting new friends and colleagues to Zoom. We'll start in roughly in a minute. You take a nice position in your chair and get ready. All right, it is now 9 a.m. in the UK and 4 p.m. in Hong Kong and here in Australia where I'm joining you today. So we're going to just kick off the seminar. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the very final seminar in the Sociology of Teaching and Learning seminar series by the Consortium for Higher Education Research in Asia at the University of Hong Kong. I am Dr. Juuso Nieminen. I'll be hosting the seminar today, and we have the absolute honor of having Dr. Karen Kravett joining us today to talk us about relational pedagogies. Before introducing Karen, let me just briefly know how this seminar is going to work today. So, as in the previous seminars, we will have a talk for around half an hour, after which the rest of the time is devoted to all sorts of questions, comments, ideas, and dialogues. During the presentation, if you happen to have any thoughts, questions, you can post in the chat, or you can simply wait for your turn after the presentation is done. So, as per usual, we'll keep it quite relaxed. But all right, let's, without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Dr. Karen Kravett is an associate professor and director for research at the Surrey Institute of Education at the University of Surrey, UK. Her research focuses on theory practice of higher education and explores the areas of student engagement, belonging, and relational pedagogies. She is director of Language, Literacies, and Learning Research Group, a member of the SRHE Governing Council, and a member of the editorial board for Teaching in Higher Education and Learning Media and Technology. She is also a principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy and an honorary associate professor at the Center for Assessment for Digital Learning, Cradle at Deakin University. Karen's work has been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, the Society for Research in Higher Education, the Association for Learning Development in Higher Education, the British Association for Applied Linguistics, and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Her latest books are Relational Pedagogies, Connections and Mattering in Higher Education, and Dominant Discourses in Higher Education with Ian Kinchi. All righty. Are you ready to go, Karen?
Yeah, I'm ready, so.
Wonderful.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you for that kind invitation to speak with you all today. I'm really excited to be with you this morning, afternoon, evening, and also how lovely to be the closing speaker for what looks like it's been a fantastic series. So thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for joining me. So I'm going to talk today about my thinking and practice, my research and my teaching in this area of relational pedagogy, which involves thinking about relationality, connections, and the higher education sector, and how these ideas might play out in our learning and teaching theory practice. I'm going to draw upon some work that's been funded by the Society for Research in Higher Education and the ESRC, and also some recent insights from my teaching as I go throughout. So as I talk, there's going to be some literature that I refer to, and I've put it in an accompanying document, which hopefully you can all access. I'll also potentially share the slides if that's possible after with you. So, okay, so first of all, and I should actually begin this talk with a trigger warning. So my talk does contain some utopian thinking, also potentially some idealism. I want to think about what does it mean to work, teach and learn in higher education today, but more importantly, what should and could it mean? Now, I've been struggling a little bit recently with thinking about relational pedagogies and the kinds of futures that we might want to create in university, which perhaps maybe you also have, because the HE sector is very much experiencing a period of turbulence. Certainly in the UK, it's quite a difficult time with currently looking at about 40% of universities experiencing rounds of redundancies or voluntary severance processes, and forecasting potential deficits for the future. And I got to thinking, you know, is there even any point thinking about the kinds of university futures we want to create, or the kinds of pedagogies we want to enact, or the value of meaningful relationships and connections in learning and teaching, given the stark financial situation that many universities are experiencing? And then I thought, actually, no, on the contrary, in times of difficulty and challenge, it's actually even more important that we stop, pause, and think about what matters to us as educators, the kinds of futures that we want to create, and why those futures are important and worth fighting for. So that's the situation, the sort of backdrop to my talk today. And I wanted to just pause for a minute to think about higher education in your context. It's so lovely that we've got so many of you coming from all over the world. And I just wanted to take a moment and for you to think about what for you are the key challenges impacting upon your institutions or your work in teaching and learning today. Feel free just to take a moment to think about those independently. But if you want to share any comments or thoughts in the chat, please also do. And I'll just pause for a moment while we reflect on that question. What are the key challenges impacting upon your work in teaching and learning today? Danielle, thank you for your comment. The othering of third space higher education professionals. Absolutely. Yeah, this is something that I have experienced myself, coming from a background as an academic librarian and a learning developer, and how we make colleagues in all departments and spaces and places of the university feel valued and that they matter is such an important question. Thank you. The very first thing that comes to mind at the end of the semester, time frames. I know time is such an important and challenging question, isn't it? We're always busy and the pressures upon our time are increasing, aren't they? Gwenda, for staff student ratios, yeah, absolutely. And this is something, workloads are something that it feels that it's an increasing challenge. And as you say, it's so important, it's so difficult, isn't it, to get to know our students properly and well when we have these high ratios. Karina, resistance to change among teachers. Yeah, when we feel like we've got no time and our workloads are challenging, then we do feel demotivated, don't we? And resistant to new initiatives. Kay, yeah, the frenetic busyness of educators and also anxiety for students. Yeah, absolutely. We worry about our students, don't we? And it's such a difficult time, cost of living crises, worries about well-being and isolation amongst our students. Serena, yeah, the diversity of learning needs, absolutely. Yeah, we want to support our diverse students. Constant rounds of external review, Julie, yeah, absolutely, getting in the way of meaningful improvements. Yep. Anissa, traditional teaching methods, so potentially thinking about those or reviewing them. Danielle, the promotions require evidence, education excellence, but is there a shared understanding in those evaluating? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, concepts like excellence are so amorphous and open to multiplicity in the ways in which we understand and enact them, aren't they? Brilliant. So thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. It's really helpful to understand some of the challenges that you're experiencing. And I also wanted to share some of the sort of discourses and concerns and ideas surrounding the work that I've been doing. And some of the things that I was thinking of were similar to what you shared, but this idea, the challenge of making connections with students, how we might do that given increased workloads, pressures upon student-staff relationships, the need to support a diverse community of students and staff, and the need to sort of foster greater opportunities for social justice and socially just pedagogies in our universities. Thinking about the changing landscape of the digital university and the role of digital practices upon our work. Thinking about how we can foster belonging between students and staff in our universities, the wider backdrop of the problems and challenges of developing a sustainable model of higher education, and the role of care. I've got here Kathleen Lynch's paper about carelessness, a hidden doxa in higher education, thinking about how we enact care, but also how problematic care is in our sector. So we come at this question of what relational pedagogies are, how we might enact them and think about them in a time of where there's lots of pressures and challenges upon us. So I've got here as well, the increasing pressures on educators, which we've discussed in the chat a little bit. It's an era of uncertainty, I feel. I mean, I've worked in higher education for about 20 years, but I feel that there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly at the moment. And the affordances of generative artificial intelligence are in part exciting, but also in part challenging and bring with it concerns and questions for us to grapple with. Questions of individualism and personalization, how we support individual students and their needs, and how we manage this with a collective approach. Well-being concerns, we've mentioned them. It's a tough time for students and staff alike, and educational disparities remain entrenched. So we want to create more opportunities and spaces for social justice and inclusivity, but this isn't happening in any fast manner. And I mentioned the digital university, which is just, a backdrop of increased avenues for change at the moment. I also have been thinking about the effective and emotional and complex nature of teaching and learning, and the idea that I have noticed in my work in universities with teachers, that actually teaching is often understood as a very cognitive process of information transmission. I think we still operate within this general sort of mode of thinking about teaching and learning, that it's something that we can teach in what work style approaches with skills or strategies for content delivery that can be standardized. And my thinking about relationality and connection is very much moving away from this idea and actually looking to find ways to celebrate the role of variance, emergence, fluidity and complexity in our educational interactions, and thinking about how we can create spaces and opportunities for them. And in my thinking about relationality, I have drawn upon a number of fabulous theorists. The sort of broad field is perhaps understood as posthumanism, but there's lots of different influences here from a range of different kinds of thinkers and researchers. And I've got a selection of them up here. Really interesting ideas. And those of you that know me will know that, I love thinking with theory. And I think that there's a theory for everybody, something that will bring you inspiration. And I particularly like this quote here by Maggie McClure, who talks about the power of theory. And McClure here says, theory offers us new ways to see the world and opens new possibilities for thinking and doing. If ever there was a time when we needed new possibilities in the HE sector for thinking and doing, it could be now. So I think looking at theory and theories that enable us to see the world in new ways can potentially be really exciting and generative. And this quote as well from Elizabeth Adams St. Pierre, she talks about one of the things that happens when you read theory, and especially when you study ontology, is that the old words don't work anymore. And I think this is a really sort of exciting quote for me, because it just means that to me that the more that we read different things and different ideas, some of the old words that we had, I'll give one example, which for me is content delivery. And when people talk to me about how they deliver their teaching, I don't really understand what they mean, because I can't deliver teaching. It's not something that I give to somebody in a transmission approach. So I think there's definitely something really exciting about how when we read theory and we engage with theory that talks to us, whatever that theory is, a theory that talks to us, it enables us to actually really think quite differently from how we did before, and to question some of the assumptions that we might take for granted in higher education. Now, obviously there was a lot of books shared there, and there's a lot of reading that we might do, but I just want to draw upon two concepts from my thinking that I find really helpful. The first one is responsibility, which is a concept that arises in work by Donna Haraway and others. But the idea of responsibility is thinking about how we have the power or the position to respond to situations in different ways, thinking about how we are entangled with those situations and we can respond. And it moves away from the idea of responsibility, which is more of a paternalistic concept that we might have power over another, to thinking about our ability to respond. And as I said, thinking about our position with others in a more relational and entangled way. Now, the other concept that I find really helpful for thinking about teaching and learning is the notion of affirmative ethics, from work by Rosie Braidotti. And here the definition of affirmative ethics is that it's a praxis of constructing positivity, thus propelling new social conditions and relations into being. I think this idea of affirmative ethics is really helpful for thinking about teaching and learning interactions, because we can think about when is there opportunities to actually act in ways that are positive, that are affirmative, that create new conditions and relations and help them to come into being. And that might be, for example, in our teaching, it might be in our reviewing of others' work, it might be in the questions that we ask, in the way that we treat students and staff, in the way that we treat ourselves. So a couple of ideas there, and I like to draw upon relational theories and these and other concepts, and I have done in my book, to ask, what do these ideas mean for pedagogy? How do they inform teaching, learning, curriculum and assessment? How can we think about connections between ourselves and our spaces and things in new ways? And how can we answer the question who and what matters in higher education? For me, these ideas help us to think about the ethical nature, the affirmative nature, but also the ethical nature of teaching, learning and assessment. We might think about teaching, learning and assessment as relational and ethical acts. Now, one of the places that I have unpacked this is in a paper, a recent paper with fabulous colleagues. I think Nikki's here with us today. Nikki, Carol and I explored pedagogies of mattering, which is how we termed our thinking about some of these relational pedagogies, and particularly the implications of thinking with these kinds of theories for thinking about care and an uncaring higher education system. And in this paper, which is open access, please do read it if you're interested, we think about how relationality and some of these concepts produce fundamental shifts in how we might think about ontology, epistemology, and ethics. So they really change the ways in which we think about how we relate to each other. As I said, thinking about how we might be entangled, able to respond to one another in more affirmative ways. And thinking about how teaching, learning and assessment might be viewed as a question of ethics. We hope that this kind of thinking can enable us to produce potentially more inclusive knowledge and research practices. I did forewarn you, there's some idealism and utopian thinking in here. Crucially, one of the sort of binding ideas about posthumanism and relational theories is that they decenter the human. So they move away from and destabilize the idea that teaching or learning is ever just about the power, the position, the authority of the teacher, or even the student. It's always a relational idea where teacher, student, body, space, object, classroom, atmosphere, wider context, all entangle together to produce an interaction. And I find that this is really, really helpful and quite challenging, actually, quite destabilizing to how we've thought about education for many, many decades. Diane Malka explains this quite nicely, and she argues that relationality comes to the fore, challenging the understanding that a traditional knowing subject, be that the teacher or whoever, lies at the heart of learning, and that this subject is in any way separable from its relations with the world. So what then does this mean? Do these ideas mean? So in many ways, it enables us to think about teaching not as a cognitive process of information transmission, but as something much more emergent, something relational, something dynamic and fluid. And crucially, it helps us, I think, to think about the power of effect and the effective atmospheres that pervade our institutions, our classrooms, and our relationships, and thinking about how we might play or mold or at least recognize those effective atmospheres and how they shape educational encounters. It also helps us to think about connection. And in my book, I explore relationality as the entanglement, but also as the concept of relationship. And I look to thinking about how teachers can think about connections, and they can think about fostering connections through practices of vulnerability, generating trust, seeking to demonstrate authenticity, and also partnership. But as I said, it's not just about what the human teacher can do, and it's also thinking about the power of the material, objects, the effect and vibrancy of things and spaces. For assessment, relational pedagogies have a huge role to play in changing our thinking potentially about assessment practices. They draw our attention to thinking about how assessment is always entangled in hugely effective power relations and accepted knowledge practices. It might encourage us to position assessment instead as a material discursive doing, a relational doing and a connection, as opposed to something within the teacher's power that is done to a student. It might encourage us to develop self and peer assessment as relational ethical acts. And this is something I've been thinking about in my practice and my program, where I lead a postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning. And we've been thinking about and redesigned our assessment to make it more of a dialogic, relational, ethical, an entangled moment rather than a doing to our participants. Relational pedagogies crucially encourage us to think about the small, to think about the micro. And again, this is a huge change really from what we usually look at in the higher education sector and in teaching learning, which is generalizable, large scale practices that can be rolled out or standardized. On the contrary, relationality is looking at situated moments and micro practice and celebrating the power. I love this phrase from Lauren Ballant. She talks about the politics of the ordinary, how we might actually celebrate those micro moments and adopt a noticing stance where we look at the everyday and celebrate the politics of the everyday. Now, I appreciate that noticing small moments and practices can be incredibly difficult given the challenges that we outlined at the start of this talk. But at the same time, we also know that the power of the small, the power of the micro can actually be really, really important and worthwhile. Relational pedagogies also encourage us to think about technologies, and I think this is hugely important for our present situation in the digital university. So for me, thinking about relationality and thinking about some of these theories encourages us to ask, what do technologies do? So rather than thinking of technologies as simply tools that we just use without any potential sort of complexity or wider thought, we might understand the role of technologies as actually having agency to change and impact upon our work. And nowhere is this more clear than in the increasing encroachment of Gen AI, and how AI is actually shaping, transforming and changing even what we think about learning and teaching to look like. It also encourages us to ask questions about space. How do we understand spaces as shaping our experiences of student engagement or belonging in different ways? And again, here, space isn't just a uniform or neutral backdrop. Both space and technology are understood to have power to change and shape our practices. It might encourage us to ask how are connections made, to think about this concept of mattering and how students and also staff experience senses of mattering. And crucially, to think about how teaching and learning relations are entangled in matters of power, and how inequalities are produced through the relation of bodies, spaces, and things. And I believe that relational pedagogies, understood in this way, and the questions that accompany our thinking in this way, can potentially foster more caring and ethical ways of working with our students by encouraging us to notice our institutions, practices, and learning spaces in new ways. So this has just been sort of a very brief overview to some of the thinking that I've been doing in my teaching and research over recent years. And of course, there's much more depth to explore in some of the papers in the books, and please do. And I just wanted to close by drawing your attention to some of the recent work that I've done that you might want to have a look at. And the first area of interest that I've been exploring is the role of belonging for students and staff. The role of belonging is really, really important, and I think we're getting on board with thinking about this and actually troubling this a lot more recently in the sector, and thinking about how relational pedagogies and belonging interact. This paper is the result of a study that I did with colleagues, a collective biography study where we explored the role of staff belonging. And I think that thinking about how staff experience senses of non-belonging and belonging is really important as we explore and recognise the importance of belonging for students as well. I mentioned how I've been thinking a lot about affect and affective atmospheres. In this recent paper, I explore with a colleague the role of affect and emotion within teaching, learning and assessment. And actually we draw upon the concept of inconvenience from Lauren Ballant to think about teaching and learning and educational interactions as potentially inconvenient, as disruptive. For me, this moves entirely away from notions of content delivery or transmission to look at the way, and help us to ask the question, how does teaching and learning feel? How do the micro moments and practices of teaching and learning feel, and how are they experienced and felt materially and in different ways? And what as teachers does our recognition of this enable us to do? And lastly, I wanted to draw attention to a website with some resources that we have designed on student belonging. This is freely available, and I can put the link in the chat in a moment. The postcards, you can download them. They've been designed by a fantastic artist, Astrid Jekyll, and they were based on research that we did with students funded by the ESRC and SRHE, research that I did with two colleagues in Australia, Sarah O'Shea and Rola Ajawi, where students told us about how they experienced contemporary universities and how they experienced relationships mattering and senses of belonging and non-belonging in those situated spaces. I hope that you'll find the resources useful, and please do let us know how you get on using them. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I'm going to stop sharing now, and thank you so much for listening. And I'll put some of those links in the chat too. And then Yuso, I think it's over with lots of time for questions and discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen, for an absolutely wonderful presentation. I was just looking for the link for your the final resources that you shared, and everyone, I will post the link in a moment. But let's kick off the space. Oh, you were faster. But let's kick off the second half of the seminar today, which is all for questions, thoughts, conversations, dialogues. So everyone, if you happen to have any questions or thoughts, do post them in the chat, or you can also use your digital Zoom hand to raise it up and ask for permission to speak, and you will be granted one, or you can turn on your video and raise your very physical hand. So every means are possible here. Let's start by a question by Julie Arnold in the chat. So let me read it out. So Karen, could you say more about the potential of peer and self-assessment practices, or so-called assessment as dialogue, to foster more caring and ethical ways of learning and with students?
Yes, yeah, thank you for that question. I think the thing about thinking with relational theories and posthumanism is the more that you start to think about the ways in which they change your understanding of the world, the more that everything shifts. So it might start as like a slight sort of thinking, and then slowly, the more that you read and think about them, the more everything changes. And certainly, you know, I have experienced and taught and been on the other end of, as I'm sure all of us have, the traditional modes of assessment that are done to us, that the assessment is in the hand of the teacher. Power relations are quite rigid. They're often not very dialogic, or emergent or open. And I think if we think about relationality, concepts of mattering, asking ourselves the question, how can we make students experience a sense of mattering within assessment? How can we adopt assessment practices that are caring, that are ethical, that are there are opportunities as assessment for learning, that are where we think about questions of effect, all of those kinds of things, then it leads us to change our assessment practices, whether that be peer, self, or other kind. And certainly in our in my university, the University of Surrey, we changed our assessment processes. So we had practices which were traditional written assignments that participants submit to the teachers mark, so forth, given grade. And we moved to a wholly dialogic oral conversation as a programmatic assessment, one summative assessment for the whole programme of an hour-long oral conversation, which is very dialogic. And it's been fabulous, not without challenge, of course, but so exciting to actually have these moments where we have genuine dialogues, where students bring their information and ideas, but we also learn, and it's a meaningful moment where we really view assessment as a practice for learning. So I think there's so much scope to think differently, that I think once you start thinking with these kinds of theories, it can be really exciting to review all kinds of practices that we do in teaching and learning and assessment.
Julie, are you happy with the response? Would you like to continue the dialogue? Let's see. Julie might. There you are.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen, for that. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult.
Oh, we could hear you, Julie. But now you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that. I have been having a little conversation with Kathy Elliott at the University College London about some of the work that she's been doing with ungrading and the kinds of relational differences that's making in the courses that she's doing, you know, and what you said about, you know, I've been thinking about assessment as a dialogue and the ways that students we're teaching now at universities really have to have different relationships with what they're coming to know. And the ways that we assess at universities is really consequential for that, I think. But the ways that we have traditionally worked at universities are so rigid and often so difficult to change, especially with professional preparation courses, you know, that are overseen by external bodies. So I sense in this moment that we're kind of itching to experiment, but that experimentation doesn't always happen as quickly as we want to. I don't know if that's a response at all. It's certainly not another question, but I'd just really like to get started a bit more quickly than I'm allowed at the moment. I love your idea of an end of unit dialogue that's meaningful and substantial, and that offers students some power in the interactive process. I think I work in initial teacher education, and so being able to pass on different ways of doing things, I think, is the best way to produce critically aware school teachers as well. Anyway.
I absolutely agree, and we were thinking about, you know, authentic assessment and the role of authenticity, and we were thinking that, you know, this oral conversation was something that we wanted to encourage our teachers to continue to have conversations with colleagues about their developing teaching and their developing teaching selves, and also the concept of how through this dialogue where we are present with the participant, we can generate authenticity because we genuinely, you know, care about the dialogue that unfolds. However, I don't mean to suggest it was in any way easy, and I feel your pain absolutely about the speed in which change can happen in institutions, and about the momentous sort of energy and will it takes to drive change. We encountered a lot of problems. The system doesn't like the fact that our program doesn't have any modules. It refuses to accept that the word module is not relevant to our program. Yeah, I feel your pain, and I would encourage you to draw upon, you know, the fantastic work that's happening in the sector. I mean, USO's work on assessment and other fabulous colleagues in this space as well. Kay and others are doing some really exciting things, so we can sort of shore up energy from colleagues, I think, with our desire to change. But also I would come to the point that I think, which is really important about all of this change, is that micro changes can make a real difference, and sometimes it's just doing something little and chipping away, and then people go, oh, that looks interesting, maybe I want to do that too, or oh, the students really like that small change, and building incremental change can also be really effective, I think.
That's a really good point. And I'm thinking taking also hold of the moment, you know, in initial teacher education, a lesson plan or a unit plan used to be an authentic piece of assessment. And because those artifacts can be so easily generated by artificial intelligence technologies, all of a sudden they are no longer authentic assessment. So we can make a case. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'm thinking about what matters as well. I mean, of course, you know, teaching colleagues to learn how to write and devise a lesson plan might be one element of importance, but as you say, it's becoming less so. But also, for me, I think when we develop our new teachers, what's as important is encouraging them to have the confidence to follow the lesson and the class as it moves, as it emerges, as people, as it changes and flows, and to experience that effective atmosphere of the class, and to be confident to go with where the students' eyes is. Yeah, so it's really interesting. Well, good luck with your work.
Thank you so much.
Can I just jump in? I know we have a couple of questions in the chat, but we have plenty of time, so I'm just going to continue this dialogue just a bit. Karen, I think you mentioned that you're leading a program that does not have modularized courses, and I'd be very interested if you like share words about that, because I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about this power of these micro moments, and I really went back to my memories of being a secondary teacher earlier myself, and I realized how different that mindset it is towards working with the same students for a longer period of time. And I was listening to you, and I thought that I realized that this year, for the first time, I was teaching one student cohort in 2 different courses. And that completely changed something in my mind in a very embodied, experienced way. So could you share a bit more about that program that you're leading, and perhaps there's something that we could teach in our modularized systems around the world from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So our program is a postgraduate certificate in teaching and learning in higher ed, which is a program for advanced. It's accredited by Advanced HE for lecturers and other teaching colleagues in universities. Very prevalent in the UK, and the program is quite large at present with about 120 participants. And a few years ago we had to redesign the program from scratch, and we decided to do away with the former system, which was 4 modules, which all ended with 4 written assignments, quite conventional, to implement a programmatic assessment approach where we have one long program which is divided into 6 overlapping themes that are not linear but are taught throughout. We have formative feedback opportunities and dialogues and so forth throughout as participants create a portfolio. But at the end of the program, the assessment weighting is on an hour-long dialogue with 3 assessors, including 2 tutors and an external colleague. And it has been, really quite a change for university systems and processes, but also just for the concept. Sometimes we still find ourselves going, okay, so I'm going to teach theme 1 and then theme 2, and sort of getting away from the modularized conception of delivery. But actually our thinking was that we had noticed that, which is proven in the literature and across the sector, the difficulties with bounded modules and participants or students' ability to then take concepts across and throughout. And we wanted to also, given that we are a program for teachers, to be at the forefront of modelling and experimenting with assessment processes. So it's been a lot of, it's been, in some ways, it's sort of additional work because we teach the participants in small group tutorials. It's very much trying to enact relational pedagogies where we get to know our tutees. And as we know, relational pedagogies take time and they are not easy. But yeah, it's been a really exciting learning process for all of us.
What an inspiring example of like bending the timescapes of higher education. There are a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to ask the one by Serena Nolan. And Karen, you might want to critically engage with this question in a couple of ways. So what methods or tools are commonly used to measure students' sense of belonging in research? Oh, I guess this could mean teachers and researchers as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Serena, because I think that, I was doing a literature search the other day on belonging, and it was fascinating how belonging as an area of research has exploded in the last 5 years. It's become on almost everybody's agenda now in HE in ways that it just wasn't. And so there is a lot of research happening. And what's happening is that people are approaching the concept of belonging in very, very different ways. You use this phrase, a sense of belonging, and people are using that very commonly as well. People are seeking to measure a singular sense of belonging, and I have seen people even do this quantitatively with scales and so forth. For me, there's tensions with that approach and the ways in which I do my research. I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's wrong for me. And I think for me, what's much more interesting is how belonging is not understood in a uniform way. So when we talk about belonging, and actually this was born out of the research that we did with students and staff, the ways that students and staff conceptualize and understand what belonging is very diverse. There's multiple conceptions, and therefore we were drawn to the realization that actually belonging should be understood as multiple senses of belonging. Also, our research surfaced the fact that belonging is really a complex sociological phenomenon. It's an effect, it's a feeling, it's a space, it's a time, it's fleeting, it's flickering and in flux. It changes and evolves, and it cannot be fixed in finite ways. So for me then, the desire or the quest to measure belonging in numerical or quantitative ways is discordant with what I understand belonging to mean and what the students in our research told us belonging meant to them. So I would be quite uncomfortable with that approach. And rather, I think the methods that I like to use to unpack and understand belonging tend to be qualitative or post-qualitative. So, for example, with our students, we did interviews, but we also did some fascinating vlogs, video logs, where they recorded on their phones just for 5 minutes, and they showed us what belonging meant to them. And sometimes it was, you know, their space. It was fascinating. So some of the students said, you know, for me, belonging is having access to all my snacks. It was like a special outfit, it was a special study space, it was a perfume, it was feeling warm, it was a space in the library, it was a peer group. So the vlogs was really effective. With the staff, we did a research study, a collective biography, which is a narrative approach, a little bit like an autoethnography, but in a collective way, where we storied together and developed a collective storying approach. That was really, really generative as well. But photo voice as well would be really fantastic, I think. So because of my own epistemological and ontological perspective, I tend to be drawn to post-qualitative and qualitative approaches, which would be uncomfortable with the idea of measuring a singular sense of belonging. But it's interesting the point that you raised, because belonging is being researched in some quite different ways across the sector. But I think that's what's you know, common to our sector anyway. You know, higher education studies is a field. It's a field that's informed by a diverse range of researchers who come with different conceptions of what research is and what research should look like, and that's an interesting, you know, area to explore as well in itself, perhaps another time.
Wonderful. Would anyone like to continue the conversation? Well, maybe if someone wants to do that, we can still jump back to this. Serena's commented briefly in the chat, but I'm just going to jump to the next question. We have around 13 minutes left, so there's still plenty of time for a couple of questions. So Gwenda Minor is asking, but I think you mentioned collective approaches to individualism and personalization. Could you please expand on that?
Yes, so relational pedagogies and the kinds of theories that I've been thinking with all evolve around the idea of decentering the human, decentering the individual, and thinking about the ways in which we teach, learn, and inhabit in the world as very much entangled and interconnected, or even intra-connected to people and things. I think it's important then, because what's at the same time, there are very, very apparent discourses in our sector that jar with this collective approach. So there are lots of discourses, particularly coming from technologies, that prioritize the individual and the value or purported value of personalization. So many sort of ed tech companies sort of say, you know, I can be this tool can be your route to sort of personalized learning or personalized a personalized tutor, you know, just for you. There is a trend of sort of thinking about the need to offer individualized and personalized approaches, which I think jars with the kinds of things that I think we might want to value more. And for me, those things are collective approaches. Affirmative ethics is about looking for affirmative but also collegial, collaborative, and entangled ways of teaching, learning, and supporting one another. So I think it's quite interesting to think about the tension between those discourses which are happening across the sector. And I worry about individualized, personalized approaches to thinking about education, because I think they conflict with the kinds of sociological approaches that we want to foster and enact. And at the moment, we know that students and staff are experiencing acute senses of non-belonging and isolation. For example, a recent Higher Education Policy Institute said that at least 1 in 4 students experience a sense of loneliness, most, if not all the time. And my worry is that individualism can potentially foster loneliness, and can potentially foster non-belonging. And I wonder what we could do if we prioritize more collective relational approaches to supporting one another. But yeah, this is just my my own thinking about it at the moment.
Thank you. Tracy, would you be happy to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to read it? I can see a camera.
Hi, hello, Yuso. Thank you. Wonderful. I've been in all of your seminars, so I feel honored to be in this closing one. Thank you, Karen, for your wonderful talk. Very inspiring.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. I really love the notion of effective encounters, relational pedagogies. And I believe, I don't know if I'm doing it right or wrong, but I believe I've been practicing it in some of my courses. And also
There's no right or wrong.
I also encountered like caring pedagogies, especially during the COVID-19 period. I wonder if you also could comment on like caring pedagogy and how it might be related to the notion of relational pedagogy. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually, some of our thinking about relational pedagogies, and particularly the paper on pedagogies of mattering, and Nikki, I know, is here in the audience, that we wrote, came from this need, this sort of interest in troubling the concept of care. So of course, care has been a huge area of educational studies, thinking and research for many years. The ethic of care with Nell Noddings and Carol Gilligan, for example, it's been a hugely helpful area of work. But we were interested in we were a little bit concerned maybe about how care was potentially not being problematized enough. And we were interested in troubling the concept of caring as a straightforward, sort of fluffy, idealistic practice that was easily achieved. We noticed that caring practices were actually accompanied by a significant amount of emotional labor and time. We noticed that caring practices were often highly gendered, that perhaps not enough attention was being placed upon who does the caring and where the caring happens and where the caring is expected. And relational pedagogies are not intended to be, you know, assumed as necessarily positive or fluffy or easy. That we found that the concept of relationality draws our attention to thinking about all of the different elements that shape a practice. For example, you know, gender, time, space, affordances of what's potentially available to the teacher to care, the pressures and so forth. And we felt that thinking about relationality maybe helped us to move away from the idea that it was all on the teacher, that all the onus was on the teacher to care, in actually thinking about all of the other elements that either constrain or enable our abilities to respond to another and to care, to thinking about caring as a more problematic and complex practice. Of course, we still completely value caring, and caring is hugely important, but it was sort of troubling this ethic of care as being a little bit more complex, which I think is urgently needed. I think for me that was really came out of the pandemic. I remember, you know, homeschooling my 2 children whilst trying to teach and do a full-time job, you know, in a really tiny space. And I'm sure many of us were in this situation. And I just remember thinking, like, this is a really challenging time and I want to care about everybody and I'm really struggling. So I think relational pedagogies for me encourages us to think about mattering and caring, who matters, what matters, but also bringing in the role of other actors and forces, whether that be political, material, social, to actually trouble it in new ways.
Well, thank you. You have completely persuaded me into relational pedagogies.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's a good outcome for.
Yeah.
All right, we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see how it goes. I'm going to start with a question by Karina in the chat. Karina, would you like to ask yourself?
Oh, hi. Yes. So I have 2 questions, and there are some one of them is quite just, fundamental. It's just question about learning in general. So I think it might take a bit of time to respond to such question. But anyway, thank you for your presentation. I think I started learning about relational pedagogy from a recent workshop on compassionate assessment. So I remember your presentation. I really enjoyed it as well. So the first question, of course, for me is how such thinking, especially in relation to assessment, as you mentioned, you defined it as a dialogic, relational, and entangled moment. And I was wondering how it changed your practice. I mean, how such way of thinking impacted what students received in the end of the day. Like, what sort of assessment do you implement? How do you assess or evaluate the outcomes? And the second part of the question is that you defined teaching, but I would love to know, how does relational pedagogy define learning, student learning? Because is it somehow, does relational pedagogy connect with theories of learning? And what kind of theories of learning does it use? So, because I think it's really important to start from the very fundamental part, because this seemed to be not very clear for me. Of course, there were words such as emergent, dynamic, and relational, but I would love to, to hear more, elaborate on that if it's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, Karina. So I'll try and do do your questions justice. But if not, and apologies, I won't get to some of the others in the chat. Feel free to email me another time. Anybody who I don't get to. But yes, so the assessment practice that we adopt in this particular example has changed what assessment is and means in fundamental ways. We have moved away from numerical grading. Participants are offered a pass with merit, pass with distinction, but very much the emphasis is on the encounter, the assessment experience as a mode of assessment for learning, the dialogue that happens between teachers and students in that moment. And it's probably, if I could choose one of the most significant changes, for me, the difference between being at home on my own or being in my office on my own and marking scripts and writing grades and written feedback, as opposed to being in this experience, this dialogue, and actually talking and responding and learning for myself and feeling the effects of the moment, it has been transformational in my own thinking about what assessment could look like. In terms of the wider concept of how do relational pedagogies change learning, absolutely, it's not just about teaching, it's also entirely about learning, and it's not even just about education, it's about how we position ourselves within the world. And I think for me, if we were thinking particularly about learning, it would be thinking about how learning is not just, a student's learning is not the responsibility of the teacher. Neither is it just the responsibility of the learner. This is a space that we come into, that things inhibit and change. If we think about, for example, feedback, there was a long history of feedback being information, something that the teacher gives to the student. Then in sort of recent decades, we've explored a lot more about how learning through feedback could be within the student's control, and it's about engaging with feedback. But I'm interested in looking about how learning is the student, the teacher, the space, the political situation, the other affordances or constraints, objects, power relations, effects, all of the different elements or actors that can potentially shape a learning interaction. So yes, it's absolutely fundamental for thinking about learning as well as teaching.
Thank you. I think we have 2 minutes left, so let's maybe bring some other questions to the floor. Yeah, thank you so much.
I think what we'll actually do, because we have a bit more than a minute left, and I look at these questions, they are wonderful, but they might open up a bit of a longer conversation. So we're almost out of time, which very much relates to the topic of today, unfortunately. So if you do want to ask your question later on, to reach out to Dr. Karen Kravett, via the contact details in the slides. But at this point, it is my pleasure to thank you so much, Karen, for joining our seminar series. This has been an absolutely wonderful seminar. And thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful rest of the day, evening, morning, depending on where you are. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Yusun, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.